Hello everybody, my name is John Michael Cologne, and I'm going to be talking to you today about the future of... And I'm going to be talking to you today, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Cool. So my name is John Michael Cologne, and I'm going to be talking to you today about the future of the humanities, which is a very important topic to me personally, because I am an English major, which, you know, means I've sort of resigned myself to the fact that I'm going to be spending the rest of my life reading obscure hipster books while working as a barista in Portland, Oregon or something. Now, do you see how that joke worked? So that was self-deprecation, right? Which is a form of ironic deflection, which is a common literary technique. See, you wouldn't expect an English major to call his own profession useless, right? This is clearly meant to thwart your expectations. Irony, which creates humor. The humor being meant to deflect, that is, to take your attention away from a potentially awkward truth. Because you see, we all use ironic deflection, right? Because we all want to talk about certain things without talking about them, and to say certain things without saying them. But just this once, let's not skirt around the issue. Let's confront it head on, right? I'm a relatively smart guy. I mean, I have to be, right? You know, Princeton and everything, or at least ostensibly smart, right? So I have a lot of options in front of me. I could major in a lot of things. I'm deciding to major in English. So who here thinks that I am wasting my opportunities? One person? Okay, we at least have one honest person in the audience. Now, the way that I see it, the objections to majoring in the humanities essentially consist of three propositions, boiled down to the most basic. There's no money in it, there's no future in it, and the things that you learn are useless. Now, the first one should be easy enough to dismiss for anybody with half a soul, though I will admit that a soul can be a difficult thing to come by in a meritocracy like ours. But the other two are more substantial, and it's very important. If anybody here is a humanities major, about 19% of us at the university are nowadays. It's a shrinking number, but nevertheless an important one. Is what we're doing a waste of time? If it isn't, then we have to come to terms with the things, our problems in our approach to the humanities, which have led to the perception that it is a waste of time. But before we do that, we should probably wrap our heads around what it is that we mean when we talk about the humanities, right? Well, the humanities, which encompasses such fields as literary criticism, comparative literature, art history, philosophy, that sort of thing, are all fields which explicitly do not require the use of the scientific method. Hypothesis, experiment, analysis of evidence, conclusion. But that's just what the humanities are not. What do all these disparate fields have in common? Well, without simplifying the issue too much, I'd like to put forward the idea that what these fields have in common ultimately is reading. Particularly the idea of reading old and dusty books from various different time periods and places. This actually goes back to the original definition of the word humanist in the Renaissance, which denoted a scholar, a lover, and a teacher of old pagan books. I would argue that it's the prioritization in the humanities of this act of reading over, the analysis of evidence or in the empirical scientific sense that distinguishes the humanities from, the social sciences and the natural sciences. So what is it that we do when we read? Well, this is actually kind of a very fraught question that if you ask, two academics, they'll give you radically different answers. But for the purposes of argument today, I'm going to put forward a very simple idea. Reading is conversation. Now, when I was a kid, I actually used to literally talk to my books. Like literally, I would be sitting there mumbling to them in my little middle school library. This was something which occasionally created awkward situations. Like for instance, one time I was doing this, and the librarian sort of walked over to shush me, and since there was nobody else around, she was like, "Who are you talking to?" And I'm like, "I'm talking to my books." And then she sort of just backed away. Never really talked to me again. But I do think that what I was doing was important, because it was reading. By talking to my books, by which I really mean talking to, the characters and talking to the authors, what I was doing was engaging in a conversation, because I wasn't just receiving these ideas and these worldviews, right? I was questioning them, challenging them, poking holes in them if I disagreed with them. And at the same time, these books were kind of doing the same thing to me, because they were defying my expectations. They were letting me swim around in somebody else's head, see the world through a different pair of eyes. And what this meant was that it was a two-way street. Because you see, I changed the books in some respect, right? Because I brought this worldview to the text that the author could not have possibly foreseen or accounted for. But on the other hand, the books changed me, because they allowed me to get outside my own head and see the world in a different way. So if the humanities are about reading, and reading is about this sort of heightened conversation, then we can immediately see the sort of benefits that this practice has for us, right? Because we all have our worldviews. We all have a sort of network of beliefs and assumptions and attitudes, conscious or unconscious, and philosophical positions that sort of compose the way that we look at things. And we get it either from the particular time and place that we live in, or also from, the fact that we all have individual temperaments and personalities and so on, right? But we can't really get outside our own heads. We can't really ever say that we, experience the world as anybody except us. But through the humanities and through the act of reading, we can, however, limitedly for a small period of time and imperfectly, get outside our own heads and look at the world through a different lens. And in doing so, we can change our way of looking at the world. Or at the very least, we can realize that the world is not actually as simple and one-dimensional as we often think it is. So I'm going to give you a very concrete example of this. Do you guys remember that critique of the humanities that I brought up earlier, that there's no money in it? Well, there's a very interesting assumption there, isn't there, sort of lurking beneath the surface, which boiled down to its most basic point is something along the lines of net worth equals human worth, which is to say that something is only valuable in as much as it can produce a monetary value. But this is really weird, isn't it? Why do we think this way? How long have we thought this way? Are there other ways of thinking? Now, the social sciences don't really provide us with much of an answer in this regard, because this is not a problem that you can really apply statistical models to, right? But on the other hand, if we were to ask Alexis de Tocqueville, who visited the United States in the 19th century and had a lot to say about the way that we, commodify things, that is to say, put a price tag on things, then he might have told us that it is a habit peculiar to America. And if we were to talk to a modern-day theorist like a Frederick Jameson, he might tell us that the moment, historically, at which this habit came to encompass all aspects of our society was at some point after World War II, in what he calls postmodern capitalism. And if we were to read the novels of a David Foster Wallace, or of Thomas Pynchon, or the stories of George Saunders, or watch a film like Wall Street, we would see, through the action of those novels and their plots and their characters and their themes and so on, we would see these assumptions in action. And when you do all these things, suddenly you can escape from this assumption. You can get outside of it. You can critique it, analyze it, date when it began and potentially when it ends. And the key thing is that you are no longer the slave to it. You are no longer the slave to received dogmas that we all have carrying around with us. We can't think of the humanities as outdated, because really the reality is that they're more contemporary than ever. When we talk about, right, often this notion of information overload. All of you have heard this, I'm sure. Now in the 21st century, with the internet and globalization, there's too much information. There's no way of knowing what's important and what's not. There's no way of knowing how to live. How do we even know what a good life is? I mean, if you talk to anybody who's actually schooled in the humanities, they'll tell you that this is nothing new. I mean, even if you go and you read the novels of, say, the last 200 years, though I would argue that all literature going back to Homer displays this, one of the key takeaways is that life is an ambiguous muddle. We don't know what to make of life. We order it, we structure it, we try to make sense of it, but it's horribly ambiguous. We don't know how to live. And anybody who's read more than one philosopher knows that to think independently, to draw our own conclusions, is to have to necessarily pick and choose between arguments that are often mutually exclusive but equally convincing. The skills that the humanities teach us are skills that we need in order to live in the 21st century. Because, the way that reading constantly, and reading a lot, shows us, that the more that we read, the more we can tell what's important and what's not. Or the ability of books to take us outside of our own heads and show us other ways of looking at the world. This is what we need in the age of information overload, more than ever. Because the difference between that age and any other age is not a difference of kind. It's a difference of degree. There's simply more of the ambiguity, or it's more obvious than it was before. So I would say that ultimately the humanities, the liberal arts, right, whatever you want to call them, are a matter of teaching us how people have thought in the past so that we can change the way that people think in the future. And that is never out of date. So why is it that oftentimes it seems so? Why is it that the humanities have lost so much prestige and therefore so much funding? And why is it, and we all know this, whether we admit it or not, that the only people in the academy who get any kind of hearing outside the academy are social scientists, usually psychologists or economists, who don't even do serious work in their field outside of the academy, but provide statistics that are later misinterpreted by journalists. Why is this the case? Well, there's a lot of reasons. I mean, I could throw some of them out for you. I mean, one of them is that we've sort of developed this view as a society to varying degrees of, dogmaticness, that the only kind of knowledge worth having is scientific knowledge, and the only kind of truth is scientific truth. Which, if you believe anything that I've told you in the last couple of minutes, just doesn't make any kind of sense. Not because science is wrong or bad or anything like that, but because there are other lenses by which we can examine the world and find truth. On the other hand, there's also the decline, at least in this country, of what I would call the public intellectual, or what used to be called the public intellectual. This is someone who doesn't create original ideas of their own, but rather re-articulates complex ideas from somewhere else in a language that an educated layman, somebody who's not a specialist, can understand. Public intellectuals are very important. I'll give you an example. Voltaire, right? Voltaire, not an original bone in Voltaire's body. He took all his ideas from other philosophers. But the reason that we read him is because nowhere do we find a better example of the ideas of the French Enlightenment. Nowhere do we find a better articulation of them. Who is our Voltaire? We don't have public intellectuals. We have pundits who regurgitate the party lines of whatever, political party they're a part of, or whatever group they're associated with. People who might qualify for the role of a public intellectual, right? Maybe like a Christopher Hitchens or a Slavoj Žižek. We don't produce them. They visit us, and they talk on our shows from, like, Europe. This is... So, these are all problems facing the humanities, but I would argue ultimately that these are symptoms. If we want to get to the roots of the problem, I would argue that we have to dig deeper. We have to look at the academic departments. Because it is my firm belief that the humanities themselves have rendered themselves irrelevant. So, the way I see it, there's kind of two types of stupidity at work, and it depends on which faction you're talking about. There's the old guard of the humanities, and there's the new guard. So the old guard of the humanities are sort of like the remnants of the people who dominated the humanities until, say, like 1960-ish. And these are the sorts of people who believe that the core of a liberal arts education is reading the classics, which, sort of translated into sardonic undergraduate speak, is like reading the great old dead white man. And this is great. I mean, at its best, what this is the preservation of a long tradition of literature and history and philosophy that every single undergraduate in the humanities ought to have under his or her belt. Our Hume sequence is a great example of this. But at its worst, this can lead to the kind of attitude which certain people profess, which the only things worth reading are the great old dead white men. And this is incredibly problematic, and you still find it in certain places. Much more common, however, are the flaws of the new guard of the humanities, who sort of took over in the 60s and 70s and have elements sort of like remaining ever since. And essentially, this is a critique of the older view, but it takes it far too much in the other direction. Because what you find are people who find real flaws within that sort of like great pantheon of great old dead white men, right? Imperialism, racism, sexism, xenophobia, etc. And what they do as a result is that they declare war. They declare a war, and their sort of like main weapon in this war is a method of reading, a kind of reading which is intentionally confrontational, which tries to sort of make a text betray itself. Because the idea is that you can read any kind of ideology into any text. So basically, imagine the idea that you can take a text which professes a certain point of view, has certain assumptions, and make the assumptions work against each other to show ultimately that your view is right and the text's view is wrong. Now, this is incredibly problematic for a lot of reasons. For one thing, this is the sort of academic work that's supposed to affect some kind of social change, but the irony of it is that oftentimes it's written in this pseudoscientific gibberish that nobody except a specialist can understand. For no reason except the fact that this is sort of like a way of getting a one-up on the social sciences, which have so displaced the humanities. On the other hand, it's also terribly useless, because if we accept the idea that reading is a conversation, that it's a two-way street, then imagine a conversation where you're the only one talking, where you're talking to yourself. You don't learn anything new. It's not a good method. And finally, I think it's self-defeating because a lot of these ideologies that are championed by this sort of academic have their origins in this flawed system, which they're trying to critique or dismiss or turn into a politically correct sort of atmosphere. So these are the problems facing us as would-be humanists, right? So what can we do to fix them? Well, I mean, this is like a very brief speech, so obviously this isn't the good place to have a prolonged manifesto, but a couple of modest proposals that we can take with us. For one thing, I think it is essential, to some extent or other, to ditch academia. We have to go outside of our little protected shell of Princeton and environs, because we know that there is a demand in the exterior world for the kind of exchange of worldviews that the humanities provide. We know this. How do we know this? Well, take every single story that you've heard or read about or whatever, about some kid, some boy or girl in the rural South who grew up in an evangelical Christian household and taught him or herself about the world beyond their sort of like very small community by looking up by themselves videos of Richard Dawkins on YouTube. We've all heard stories like this. And it shows that our age, more than any other age, is the age of self-education. We have more ways of reaching people for cheaper than ever before, which means that if we don't get our message across, this is our fault, not the public's. I believe that it is the job of a modern sort of public intellectual in the humanities to take all these old ideas, all these old thoughts, all these old books, and even the new ones that are just like, sort of locked away in dissertations in the academy, and take them to people. Put them down in a way that emphasizes their importance, that puts it in language that people can understand, and that shows how these thoughts can get us outside of our implicit assumptions as a society. You have to go into the trenches, which for us is essentially, all the places that snooty academics don't like to go, right? Cable news, the internet, public forums, that sort of thing. And if those forums don't exist, then we have to create them ourselves. We can't just stand by and let the world go by, because, there's quite a lot at stake. So, most of all, though, I believe that we have to ourselves, as humanities people and want-to-be public intellectuals, read more and read better. Because the old standard of like having that Western tradition under your belt, it's not enough anymore. We live in a globalized world where many different literary traditions, many different cultures are converging. We can no longer just settle for that canon that is the canon that we come from. We have to take all these other traditions, the Indian traditions with its Mahabharata and its Upanishads, the Chinese tradition with its Chuang-Tzu and its Journey to the West, the tradition of the Islamic Golden Age with its falsafas, the philosophers, and the myths and epics of Africa. We have to make these as familiar to us as our own tradition, and not just some kind of exotic other to analyze as if it were some kind of curiosity of an anthropologist or something. If we can't do that, then I don't think that we can call ourselves public intellectuals, humanities people for the 21st century, because the world has become much more intertwined. Now, I think that if we can succeed in doing even some of these things, we can make sure that our disciplines in the humanities not only survive into the 21st century, but flourish, because they're more needed than ever before. But if we don't do this, then I think that the risk is that we lock ourselves in an ivory tower in which we will have truly become no use to anybody. So, That's all I've got to say. Thank you, everybody.